Hi there, it's Ty at Forged Wood and Stone. If you've been following along, you've seen us build this dining room table from start to finish, and today we're going to do a video where I'm going to give you a lot more detail as to each of the steps as we progress through this build. So let's get started. So the first part of any project is picking out the right wood. We know right away this project's going to be built out of walnut, but what we want to try to do is find some really beautiful book match walnut. So this is all walnut that we sawed and dried right here at Forged Wood, and you can see I'm laying out pieces that are subsequent cuts, and we fold those open like pages in a book, and it gives this grain that mirrors itself. I'll lay out that mirror pattern with numbers and arrows to reference as we go along in the build, and that just helps me make sure everything is lined up how I intended it to be lined up. Once I'm satisfied with the lumber we've picked out and I've got everything laid out and lined up, we're going to go ahead and cut everything to a rough length. This tabletop is going to be 6 feet long, so I'm going to go ahead and cut these a little longer, like 6'3" or 6'4", and that gives me room as we move along in the job to cut it to its final length and make sure it's long enough. We're going to go ahead and rough plane the lumber as well. There again, we're not going to plane it down to its final thickness. We're just going to plane it down so it's smooth and flat enough to do our glue up. Our rough planing is done, and you can see this book match pattern starting to develop. It's just gorgeous. Now we're going to move on to the straight line rip saw and get some nice square straight rips on this lumber in preparation for the glue up. You can see a red laser line if you look close, and that's telling me where the blade is going to cut. This saw will grab the piece, pull it right through, and make a perfectly straight line. And then the next step is going to be going over to the joiner planer to get perfectly flat mated surfaces to glue together. So now we're at the joiner planer. You can see on this board there's some numbers and some letters written on the face of it, a 4B and a 3F. The numbers represent the seam in the glue up. So in this glue up we have 4 seams, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the B and the F reference the front of the board or the back of the board. And that's telling me which side of the board should be against the fence on the joiner. So when you're operating a joiner planer, you need to rotate that front to back, and that eliminates any discrepancy in how perpendicular that fence is. So if your fence is supposed to be set to 90, but let's say it's set to 89 degrees, if you alternate front to back, those two angles offset one another. So when we go to do our glue up, we have a perfectly flat mating surface. Once all the edges have been joined, we're going to lay everything back out one last time before the glue up and make sure that the grain is matching just how we want it. We're also going to put a straight line all the way across this piece. This is to help us reference exactly where these boards are supposed to line up in the glue up. Once we start applying glue, the clock starts, and we've got a limited amount of time to get these things put together exactly how they belong. So we've laid all the pieces on edge, and now we're going to start to apply glue. I use Type Bond 3. It's got a little bit longer open time than most glues, which is nice. It gives me more time to adjust the pieces before I clamp them down. And it's waterproof, so that's always a good benefit. If you're doing indoor or outdoor stuff, you want a waterproof glue. So you don't want to skimp on glue. Use plenty. You know, if it runs out, if it drips everywhere, that's fine. Unless you're doing this in your living room over the carpet or something, it's fine if it drips out. We've got everything glued, we've got everything laid out, and now we're going to start clamping things together. You can see that white line we drew earlier is lined up nice and straight, and now it's just a matter of pulling everything together. So I started applying clamps at this point. You can see the red C clamp at the end there. What that's doing is just pulling those two boards flat with one another. There's other ways to achieve this using biscuits or dominoes or special clamping jigs. The takeaway is I'm just trying to make this glue up as flat as possible. I'll address all those other methods in a later video, but this is just a simple, effective method of pulling those boards in plane with one another at the ends. So here I've finished clamping the top together. I use lots of clamps, and it's important that the clamps are on both sides of the glue up. If I were just to put clamps on the bottom, there's a really high likelihood that that entire glue up will explode upwards out of the clamps, and then I'm starting all over again. So I've got to put clamps on the top and the bottom, and I make sure that as I'm tightening those down, I'm tightening them down equally as I go to balance all of that clamping pressure and keep the top nice and flat while that glue is curing. Here we're gluing up the beam for this project. We're doing a glue up for a couple reasons. One, we don't have material that's thick enough to make the beam out of a single piece, which is a little over 3 inches thick. And two, by doing a glue up, it makes the beam more of a structural member, less prone to warping or bowing. So we basically just chose a nice thick piece for the middle, and then a couple of really nice clear pieces of walnut that match the tabletop for the outside. Again, lots of glue, lots of clamps. You can never use enough clamps, and a nice flat surface for it to sit on. So in this case, I just set it on top of the pipe clamps that were holding the tabletop together as it was drying, because I know it's a nice flat surface. So it's the next day at this point. We've taken the tabletop and the beam out of their clamps. Tight bond glue you can unclamp after about 45 minutes. I never do that. I always leave it in the clamps overnight. When it comes out of the clamps, it's going to have lots of dried up glue on the surface that's going to have to be removed. I used my wide belt sander for that. We'll get to that in a minute. But for now, we're going to focus on filling any imperfections in the surface. So here's just a few simple tools I use to clean out any loose bark or anything that needs to be pulled away before I start epoxy filling these. I like liquid glass. This is Deep Pour 24. It's good for up to 3 inches deep, I believe, and sets up in about a day. So it's not real fast, but it's not real slow. When working with walnut, I tint it to black. It just looks nice and classic. It's just a nice look. I don't really gravitate towards the bright colors when I'm using epoxy, especially with walnut. It looks just fine all by itself. Epoxy is messy. You get it everywhere. Once we sand this flat, all of those puddles, all of that ugliness will disappear, along with all of the glue that was spilling out from our joints. But that's okay. We're going to go to the sander next and clean all that up. So here we are at our Extrema 52-inch wide belt sander. This top is about 38 inches wide at this point, so it easily fits through the throat of this sander. It's going to remove all of the glue drips, all of the excess epoxy, and it's also going to level up the entire surface of the tabletop, and it's going to do all that pretty quickly. I'll probably spend about 30 or 40 minutes initially sanding this piece to get it to the point it's at right now. So I've got to admit, at this stage, I'm getting pretty excited about this project. We've just finished the rough sanding through the wide belt sander and flattening everything out, and this book match pattern is really coming alive. So it's starting to give me some glimpses of exactly how dynamic and how beautiful this walnut is. I'm just loving this grain pattern. I'm loving the book match and all the figure in it. The color is just outstanding. We're going to grab that beam we glued up also, and we're going to get it squared up and nice and smooth on all four sides using our double-sided surface planer. Man, look at that grain. This thing is just going to be gorgeous. So our next step is going to be to do the final dimensioning on this top. So for that, we're going to use our safety speed panel saw. And we can both cut the width and the length on this saw. The saw actually pivots 90 degrees on its base there. And so we can run it through that machine, trim up the ends, and know that we have a perfectly square top. and it's exactly the width and length that we're looking for. In this case, 36 inches in width and 72 inches in length. So at this point, we're ready to do the final sand out and really all the final finishing steps. We're going to go back to the Extrema wide belt sander for this. You can see here I think loading 150 grit belt into the sander, and that's going to do the majority of our finish sanding for me. And once we're done with the wide belt sander, I'll go around the edges with a router and put just a really small round over on it. We'll use orbital sanders, random orbital sanders, up to about 320 grit, and we'll spend quite a bit of time with that, making sure that we've gotten rid of any scratch pattern that was left behind by the wide belt sander. You can see that grain is just getting prettier and prettier the finer we go with the sandpaper. We're just getting everything prepped here for the final finish. One final step before we go to the finish room is installing these threaded inserts. These allow us to attach the base to the tabletop using bolts instead of wood screws. Basically, we drill a hole that accepts the insert and then use a bolt with a jam nut against the insert to drive it into the backside of the table. Once those are all installed, it just gives us a nice clean look, gives us a nice secure anchor point to attach the base to the tabletop. So now we're in the finish rooms. Final sanding has been done. We've tacked the surface off to get it free of any dust or contaminants, and we're ready to start spraying this top. So I use a catalyzed conversion varnish in my shop for a lot of furniture builds we do. It gets sprayed on in 3 coats. This is the primer coat you're seeing here. It dries very rapidly. Within the matter of about 15 minutes, we can start sanding that primer coat, and that gets rid of any dust or anything that fell on the surface that we didn't get off the tack cloth. Once we've sanded it, we can apply the top coats. I'll spray on 2 top coats, one right after another. And there again, that dries very rapidly. Within about a half an hour, we can actually handle the piece carefully, and then we'll set it aside overnight to completely dry before we proceed with final assembly. So here we are, final assembly day. You can see Rob is there working on that base, getting it cleaned up and ready to deliver to the customer. We've got that beam mounted there to the trestle style base, and it's just really looking beautiful. Once we get done with the project, we want to make sure it's perfect and ready to deliver to the customer, and we go ahead and put our brand onto the piece. This is actually a logo that my daughter came up with for me, gosh, almost 15 years ago, and we'll sign the piece so that in the future we know where and when it was built. I really enjoyed building this piece. Man, it's such a pleasure to work with this figured walnut. I mean, it's just it just never disappoints. Thank you so much for following along with this project. If you haven't already, you can go to my Facebook page and like that. You can share this video. You can also follow me on Instagram, and I even have a TikTok page. So anyhow, thanks again.